Welcome to Hallowed Ground Storycast. I'm Anya.
And I'm Alan.
And I'm Stitch. And this episode is about my eternal obsession with the unsettling horror manga, Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors.
It's a fresh entertainment alternative, and many come to experience it. We're very excited today to welcome our guest, Stitch, who is a writer, critic, and purposeful pain in your ass about anti-blackness in fandom. Stitch is here to write what needs writing very slowly.
That is correct. So let's dive into Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors.
Yeah, we're so glad that you're here today to talk about this very formative manga.
Yeah, they really should have watched what I read as a child. Yeah.
Okay, so Stitch, tell us what Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors is about.
So, Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors is the sequel series to the original Pet Shop of Horrors, and it follows Count D, who is this androgynous Chinese count. It's a term that got slapped onto his family generations ago. The interesting thing about Count D is that his pet shop sells just any kind of animal. You have normal cats and dogs, but you also have kitten, dragons. You can probably even assume they have actual Godzilla-esque kaiju somewhere in the store. And at surface glance, it's like, oh, these are just pets. But these animals aren't ordinary at any level, even the ones that we're used to seeing. Cats, dogs, bunnies, because they can turn into humans or humanoid figures. And their goal is giving their masters exactly what their heart desires, whether or not it's what they need at a given point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone sort of anthology. You know, like a customer comes in, they ask for something, and then like you said, maybe they'll get what they want, but maybe they'll get what they need, and it rarely works out the way that you would expect, and certainly not the way that the customer would expect. But it always seems to me like Count D kind of knows how it's going to go. And so like there's just something uncanny about each part of the story. And then there's like also a larger kind of overarching story that's going on with Count D and like his landlord.
Yeah.
Too.
Right.
Very
of the moment. Everyone's hating on their landlords.
Yeah.
Yeah, his landlord's especially terrible because his landlord, Wu Fei, is caught kind of between like what he has to be. He is kind of displaced mob boss, and what he wants to be, which is apparently not that. And he's also like, this is a recurring thing across both series, male characters who are assumed to be cishet always fall for D. Right? Like, I don't know who this person is, if they are a man or woman. I know that I'm attracted to them. And because this was written before people really thought about what they needed to portray in these series, like, it's relatively open-minded for a manga series from the, like, late 90s, early 2000s, but you still have, like, really throwback attitudes. So he's constantly, like, clearly into Count D, but he can't handle it, and it's hilarious to me.
Yeah, exactly. Is used as, like, kind of manga gay panic freak out moments sometimes, but there's also, like, I think there's a genuine undercurrent of queering the space. Like, the space that Count D inhabits is always liminal.
Yes.
You know, between, like, the spiritual world, liminal between masculine and feminine, between, you know, gay and straight. And so, like, Count D, like, brings characters into this space where they have to acknowledge that they have less control over everything in the world and in themselves than they like to tell themselves they do.
Well, and the gay panic didn't bother me because Count D is one of the few characters that shows up throughout, right? He's the protagonist. He feels very in control. He is not flustered at all by the gay panic.
Right.
It almost feels like a meta joke, like it's making fun of gay panic. The humor is like one level deeper than it usually was in the way that like gay panic was played on Friends or something, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
Although we have skipped a little bit ahead. Why don't we go into a little bit more detail about the production history?
All right, so Pet Shop of Horrors, both of the series that are available in English, so the sequel and this one, Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors, were created by Matsuri Akino. She is still actually working on this franchise, but the original volumes basically finished publishing about like 2006, so for both of the big series. This sequel series only has 8 of the 12 volumes published in English before publisher Tokyo Pop initially went under. Unfortunately, it is still not available digitally and is really hard to get in print.
Yeah, I mean, I was really lucky in that I was able to get it through my local library, and I was able to keep them for a while before someone else reserved them and I had to turn them back in. And then for Alan, I was able to get some used print copies on the Half Price Books website. But yeah, you do have to put in a little bit of effort to get your hands on these.
But I think it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely. So what was your first experience reading Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors, and like how old were you when you first discovered them?
So I kind of got both series at the same time. I was like 12 or 13, and I powered through the volumes that were available at the library. And by that point, nobody monitored what I read as a child, so they were just like automatically assuming anything with animation or like really pretty characters was somehow for children. So I had already been exposed to josei manga, which is aimed at older women. Like, they have complex plots. Like, this is not something that you would find given to actual children for various obvious reasons. So I was like, oh, I know what this is supposed to be like. Then I was still like unprepared for like the depth of the storytelling. And I was like, oh my gosh, Count D is a babe. The men in his life, the cis, not really het men, Leon, Orcott, and Wu Fei, I thought they were really, really interesting for how they kind of orbited him. And even from a very young age, I was into like the enemies to friends to lovers trajectory, and it felt like that's where that was going, even when I was like a tadpole. And so I was like, okay, I want more and more and more of this. It's really evident from the first volume that Wu Fei is providing that like almost erotically interested antagonist angle. And then you also have Leon, who shows up at different points across the series. I'm just like, aw, this is exactly what I need. And even as a small child, I was like already thinking like ships. I was thinking about ships.
Yeah, I think that's on purpose. And this is like a space to fantasize about these men, right? His landlord is like alpha male Yakuza type of a dude, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's a very like mafia kind of guy. And he softens a lot with Count D in interesting ways, I think.
He gets so flustered.
Yeah. Exactly. There's another element that I wanted to talk about too in the premise that we haven't addressed, that is Count D kind of manifests in Chinatown locations. It seems like he can't live in places where there's not a Chinatown, and that somehow either he's like a manifestation of that space, or like his pet shop full of spiritual creatures that are tied to China somehow needs that larger Chinese presence and culture to manifest in a foreign space.
So it's kind of explained in the earlier series how the legacy of Count D has been shaped over the years. Part of why the various Ds end up in Chinatowns is because the community of Chinatowns.
Like their interconnectedness?
Yeah, it's like this is a neighborhood that
Right.
they're around their people, even though they're not technically around their people, because they are the last of their kind. In volume 6, I think, of the original, he kind of makes a point about it. Like, he goes to a specific restaurant because it's in Chinatown. And it kind of speaks to kind of the universality of how the world treats Chinese people. If you look into the history of Chinatowns around the world, a lot of them are born out of xenophobia. Literally the refusal to let Chinese people live among other people, like predominantly white people in New York or California. It is only relatively recently in the history of Chinese immigration to the United States that Chinese people were allowed to live outside of Chinatowns and form communities. Like, it was a form of segregation that built communities in these Chinatowns.
This story even references like Chinatowns in 1930s and 40s Germany.
Yeah.
You know, during World War II.
Yeah, it's very aware of that racism and the like exoticization, I guess, of Chinese people.
But it also plays off of it.
Yeah.
Because that's like Count D's whole thing.
Yeah. One of my favorite lines was in the chapter where they're in Greece, like on the boat, and all of those other people were like, how did you stay down there so long? And he's like, you know, Chinese people are good at swimming. And everyone's
right,
like,
yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. He just like plays off of the expectations, and like he's simultaneously like poking at them and subverting them. It's kind of clear in the first volume when he's talking to Wu Fei about it, and aside from the Chinatown aspect, the heritage is really important here, because Wu Fei isn't fully Japanese, right? Like, so...
And this is a big deal in Japan.
Yeah.
If you're a half-breed in Japan, like, I don't think that, maybe a lot of people don't know this, but like, Japan is very racist.
Well,
like, a very, very racist place.
Japan is a mono, I can't remember the word, but it's mono something culture. So same with Korea and China. It's a country that has a limited amount of diversity as we understand it. And of course, that's not to ignore that there are very strong progressive politics at play. Like, I never want to ignore that there are people rooting for Naomi Osaka, like, ride or die for that young woman in Japan, who recognize her as Japanese fully, regardless of whether she wins or loses a match, right? And at the same time, the perception is that you have to be fully, like, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents to count. And I mean, that's how it is in a lot of countries. A lot of people still don't see, well, most Americans as Americans, you know?
Right.
But yeah, so
I mean, and we have our own history with the one drop rule and all of that. So.
Yeah. So Wu Fei is sort of dealing with it. Like, I don't know that anybody's making him deal with it, but he's dealing with it. And when Dee calls him out, like, are you from Hubei? He's like, like, his immediate frustration at being recognized as the other, even though Dee isn't actually judging him for it, because that would be incredibly hypocritical of Dee. It reminds Wu Fei that he is probably, I don't even think he's in the Yakuza. I think he is running a Chinese gang in the heart of Shinjuku.
Yes.
So
yeah, he's like, he's criminally adjacent. Like, he has to be aware of, like, the Yakuza and the triads and the local legitimate government. Like, it's a very delicate balancing act that he's up to. And he's very stressed.
Dee threatens to topple it, because that's what Dee does. He destabilizes. And that reminds me, so I don't know, because I don't remember if I looked at the titles, but so, yes, they do it here too. So in all of the chapters for both series, the English titles all begin with D. And I thought that was the funniest thing ever.
I noticed that.
Oh, I did not even notice that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. That's really funny.
Right, so like when I said like D destabilizes, I was like, ah, yes. Because like for volume 2, it's decoration, dealer, da capo, side story, dignity. And I don't know, because I don't have that good a grasp of Japanese yet, to know how the title conventions work in the original, but I thought it was a really interesting nod to what D represents, which is kind of everything at once.
It's like, the classic two worlds kind of thing that you get from fantasy, but D is kind of the intersection of those two worlds and is always showing the characters that they have way less control than they believe they do, over every part of life, whether it's, the detective in America or his landlord in Japan. Like in both cases, those characters both think that they understand what's going on with D, and they don't have a clue
really don't.
What's actually going on.
Yeah. Everyone thinks that he's like running a brothel.
Right,
and that his pets are prostitutes. And that's like the farthest thing from what could be happening.
Yeah.
They're very bad at this. Incredibly bad at it. I think at one point in the original series, Leon, the detective, is like, I think you're a serial killer. And I was like, you're not wrong, but you're also not right. In the first series, he's very much like, well, whatever happens to you will happen to you. I'm really not going to make an effort to help, give you guidance. He would just basically throw the customers fully into the deep end. If the customers in Tokyo listen, he's clearly giving hints. Like, kind of like the Gremlins. He's like, don't feed this one after midnight. That won't end well. He's telling you what not to do or what to do, or why the pet is that special. Although sometimes he should just say, like, yes, I'm giving you a dragon.
There's like a predatory thing about his pet shop that I appreciate. There's a parasitic aspect to the spirits that he is taking care of in his shop, who present themselves as loyal animals, and they will like give you their loyalty completely, but there's like a high cost associated with that for like you as a human being. Either, like a lot of times the person will die, or like some other kind of tragic event will unfold because of that. And so like it's not as if they're getting nothing out of it exactly. It's like a way for them to get human involvement in their lives.
I also think that the incense might be, like, I know it allows the customers to see the human form, but I think there is a mention somewhere in the first series, that the incense is lure. So there's a magical element, period, over the pet shop. Like, I think you come to it when you think you need it, or when D thinks you need it, but also I think there's something in the incense.
I think this actually has a lot to say about like pet culture. We don't think much about paying for a living creature. A pet is like its own living thing that has its own life and everything, and we kind of get it to be like, oh, I want something to cuddle and love and that will love me unconditionally. And
help me out of my depression.
Yeah, if you think about it, like that's kind of fucked up.
Is.
Like it's really kind of a weird thing, but it's very normal in our culture, in our modern culture, to just look at something else that has a life because it's a non-human creature and be like, I own you and I have very little responsibility to your life. Like you exist for me on some level. And I think that this story like really plays with that in an interesting way that turns the tables on the humans and kind of makes you think about the perspective of a pet's life in an interesting way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of times the pets are really geared towards giving the person what either they say they want or what they actually need, but wouldn't be willing to accept if it was just given to them like directly or at face value. I don't know. I think it's really interesting that we're doing this episode right after we did our Animorphs episode, because the manga, I mean, we've been focusing on the more like mystical, magical, like metaphorical aspects of it. But the manga also includes a lot of weird actual animal biology and facts.
Yes.
Like there's that chapter about the different cicada cycles and like the periods matching up. There's one about like cave adaptive animals. And the author often will like take a few pages between chapters to just be like, here's some fun animal facts that I learned while I was doing research for this one.
It's really great. There's one where at the back of the book, she's like, yeah, so black widows, well, they're venomous, and I got really into playing solitaire, and I'm like, thanks. But she's fantastic. Yeah. She clearly did a lot of research on different animals and their role in mythology or in society in order to put this together. I appreciated the mythological beings a little bit more because, like, I know what a cicada is, right? So I was like, I know that this happens. But, like, for something like a Keaton, I was like, nah, I know nothing about Keaton. So, like, having her do that arc, that's the Hitler thing.
Oh, yeah.
That's where that comes in. But that was really interesting. You know.
Yeah, like I had never heard of a kappa before, or kappa. It's probably
Kappa?
the more Japanese way to pronounce that. Yeah, the like river childs.
Yeah, they're so
mythical
stressful.
creature that they go hunt for.
They're so stressful. I guess unfortunately I had a weeb period around the time that I got into Akino Matsuri's work and like different anime series and manga series. So I knew what if they were Japanese creatures, 100% I knew them, but if they were like not something you saw in anime, I was like, initially, like, I don't know what this is. Teach me. And then thankfully, end chapter notes did.
Yeah. I love the way the structure gives her the chance to have that more like conversational, direct conversation with the reader. Like the chapters themselves are traditional stories just in the sense of like perspective and point of view and stuff, but then she gets to literally break the fourth wall and turn to the reader and say, oh, these are all the things that I was thinking about while I was doing this, and it's really cool.
It is.
Manga in general is typically like published like in a magazine format with many other manga at the same time. And so you'll like have a subscription, let's say, to a manga magazine that will be like themed. So like in this case, maybe you have a horror manga magazine. And so you'll get like one episode of Count D, and then, you know, like 3 or 4 more pages later, you get an episode of some other horror thing by a different author, artist combo, or the same person sometimes. And so this is like a collection of her stories from that magazine. And so it has extra stuff in it usually, as like, you know, since you went out of your way to buy this extra thing, here is like extra content.
I see.
If
yeah, I guess we kind of skipped over our normal structure where Alan and I talked about our first experiences, but this is literally the first manga that I've ever read.
Oh my gosh.
So maybe I know, thank you. I guess it's hard for me to maybe separate things that are like specific to this versus more general to the genre. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it took me a while to kind of get used to the flow of reading left to right, but by the end of the first volume I think I like pretty much had it down.
Right, so explain what you mean for people who maybe haven't read manga.
Oh, I guess there could be people out there who are equally as unexposed as I am. Yeah, so like if you pick up the book and hold it the way that you normally would hold an English book, you're actually looking at the back cover.
Right.
So like everything reads in the opposite direction.
This, when I first started reading manga, they actually used to publish the manga flipped.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's how I started too.
Yeah. It doesn't work, really. Like,
No, it doesn't.
it messes up the story. It's really weird because you'd think, oh, they're just flipping it. But it's kind of like how artists will be like, hey, when you finish your canvas, when you finish the sketch or whatever, flip it to make sure everything looks good, right? If you flip this, it does not look good. Not that the art's not beautiful, it's just this literally is not how... It ruins the page design.
Exactly. You know, it's just one of those things where you get used to it after a while. And they're really good usually about putting a page there that says, hey, this is the back of the book.
Yeah.
Don't start here.
Or like, so some of them are polite. This one's firm. It's like, stop. This is the back of the book. You wouldn't want to spoil a great ending. And then they have the actual directions of like how to do the panel flow.
Which was actually super helpful for me.
Yay. It's pretty great. It's a little harder when you're doing digital. I get my manga through Futekiya. It's like a boys love online subscription service. So I'm like, I know how this works objectively, but I also keep trying to swipe the other direction on my tablet.
It's like funny. A very muscle memory physical thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a general manga question. I think Matsuri Akino, did she do both the drawing and the storytelling?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. And that seems pretty unusual for American comics, right? Don't they usually have like a separate artist and writer?
So how American comics work, so DC or Marvel, you have a writer, you have a penciler, you have a colorist, you have a typesetter, and those are like the four main roles. With manga, now you have like teams, but the main person who usually gets the credit for both writing and drawing, that's the creator, right? So Matsuri Akino she did the lines and she did the story, like the dialogue, but she probably had someone come in and like, so the patterns on these clothing, right? Those are probably somebody had to put those on. Those aren't drawn. Those are like a film at this point when this came out. Yep. So somebody had to sit there and cut to make sure the patterns fit the outfit. And she wasn't doing that. So that's like an assistant job.
That happens with backgrounds a lot too in manga, where you'll either have a background artist or you'll have like a pasted kind of line art version of like, you know, like a cityscape or something like that, or like a forest, and then, you know, then you'll have the main characters who are actually line drawn by the creator.
I see. Okay. That does explain some of the like difference in textures that I was noticing, but like couldn't really pin down.
Yeah.
It's a shortcut.
I mean, it's a shortcut, but I also think it works aesthetically.
Oh yeah, it's a total aesthetic. Yeah. It's funny too because people like my age and Stitch, you know, like grew up with Japanese culture because of this kind of backdoor thing that Stitch was talking about where, you know, like the moral panic of the 1950s in America around like, is Batman gay because he has Robin? Is he a pedophile? Like his only friend is a boy. What's up with that?
Trauma.
Is this teaching kids to be gay? That whole thing like stunted the entire growth of graphic art stories in North America and completely like created this branching kind of thing between Japan and America where, like Stitch said, these stories are made for older women who are into like supernatural horror to read. And you'll have like people, you know, on their way to work reading manga. And this is kind of like someone reading like a paperback or something like that in America. Of like, you know, not like a prestigious paperback, but like a throwaway, like, I don't know.
Like a John Grisham mystery or something. But
like lower than that, you know, like, like that's really mainstream. Like like a crappy version of that. You know what I mean? Like, this is not like high art or anything, like,
Well,
but it's normal.
I would actually say, because it depends on what you're reading, right? And
Totally,
when you're
totally,
reading
totally.
it. Because so Pet Shop of Horrors is kind of very clearly punching above the weight class for the genre. Similar things out at the time were like Kimi wa Petto, which is about a woman who adopts a man as her dog, which is good, but what a terrifying premise. Because she definitely does take a man in off the street. Or Peach Girl, which was marketed to teenagers, but was not actually for teenagers. Because it depends on who you're reading and what years you were reading it in. So in Japan in the 90s, maybe it wasn't mainstream to read Pet Shop of Horrors, but it also wasn't being a woman in your 20s reading like Dragon Ball.
Right.
Because that would be like, well, why are you reading this? This is not that great.
That's weird, right? Yeah, exactly. This is for small boys. Yeah, I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that like this would seem weird for adults to be reading this stuff in America, but is not weird at all in Japan. And therefore, like, the themes that you would find in this stuff are like totally different than what North American expectations might be, but is totally normal in Japan. Like you said, they're marketing to different levels of people, and that doesn't happen with DC and Marvel and stuff. Like, it's gotten marginally better.
I see. But like, especially in the 90s, there was just the idea that like anything that's animated is for kids.
Is for children.
That's how I saw Perfect Blue when I was 13.
Perfect Blue.
And that traumatized me, because that's not a movie a 13-year-old needs to see.
I'm the same way. Like, I got into a lot of anime, and that was really part of the appeal of anime in the late 80s and 90s, was that it was edgy, right? Because like the adults around didn't really understand that this was not being marketed to children. They were like, it's animated, therefore it is for children, because like that is the aesthetic space that we carved out in America for that type of material. But that's not how it was in Japan. And so I watched something like Ninja Scroll, and they're like, oh, this is an animated thing with ninjas in it. And there's like, like hyper violence and rape and like, all kinds of very sexualized themes and stuff. And so it's like existential in its mood. And so, but that was kind of cool, right? Because like, it's like you're saying, Stitch, that you got into something that was like way above your head, but you were keeping up with it. And there's kind of this thrill of, this is adult, and like I'm in a space that I'm not quite supposed to be or ready for, but it like that's exciting and interesting all on its own. And I think manga and anime and stuff like that really delivered that for a certain generation.
I feel like it's a little different now, weirdly, because it's so much easier to get access, right? Like my niece, I have a niece who's like 17. She can just go on Crunchyroll and watch her anime. Like, I used to have to watch anime like in 3 parts on YouTube with like really messed up subtitles. And now she just goes on Crunchyroll, she watches her Naruto, and she keeps it moving, or she'll read a manga and she'll be like, hey, can you get this on your Kindle for me? And I'll buy her a manga and she'll read it, as opposed to having to go to the library. Or like, again, most of the sequels for Pet Shop of Horrors aren't in English. There's no way to legally get those in English. I was like Googling to see if the license got picked up by anyone, and I found somebody that had translated it, but that's not legal. So I'm like, well, I can't recommend that to anyone. But for years, you had no hope of getting your favorite series translated to English.
Yeah, and I think that's still largely true. Like, most manga has not been translated because there's only like a certain slice of manga that publishers were willing to take a risk on. And like the kinds of stories that were imported over here are largely like whole arcs, like entire stories. But there's a lot of stuff in Japan that's like they'll start something, it doesn't get much of an audience, and then it's just dropped. a lot of that type of stuff exists that'll have like really interesting premises and characters and be like pretty edgy and like out there, but like doesn't go anywhere. And so publishers are like, well, we're not going to mess with this because Americans don't like that.
I see. So they would kind of like translate the first few volumes of like 20 things and then only pick one to like see to the end, whatever happened to be like the most popular.
It's usually what's the most popular in Japan and what has like a full arc. So you're getting stuff like Sailor Moon or like, you know, sports manga.
So many sports
for boys
manga.
And stuff like that. Yeah.
So many.
So
horror has been picking up, like, not necessarily, like, kind of cerebral things, like Pet Shop of Horrors, but, like, Chainsaw Man. Tokyo Ghoul did really well. Tokyo Ghoul is maybe my second favorite manga series, even though, like, I frequently just shout about it. But, Tokyo Ghoul did really well when it came out, to the point where it got, like, 3 anime series. Like, it got, like, the full arc. Normally, if a show does an anime series partway through a manga, you just get up to where they get tired, right? Like, if there's no series end for the book, the anime gets, like, a mediocre ending, or they just do one arc and they're like, that's it. Tokyo Ghoul got the full arc. That's also something that wouldn't have happened when I was growing up. Like, if I liked something and it got a 12-episode anime, that was it. It's not getting the rest.
Right. Yep.
Do you want to talk about the Hitler chapter? Because what?
Yeah. Not gonna lie, really threw me for a loop. My first time through volume 1, I was like, oh, suddenly Hitler here. And like Ava Braun is our point of
customer?
View character kind of for that chapter.
Yeah, like Alan said, she's the customer. She is initially sympathetic. And then you realize she is not.
Yeah, it is a really interesting transition. It really does kind of make you sympathize with her. She's just like yearning for connection and has fallen in love with this person who obviously is literally Hitler. But you do kind of like feel for her on some level. And then it gets to the point where it's like, oh yeah, no, she's totally chill with genocide. Like, she is a super fucked up human.
Whatever makes her man happy.
Yeah.
It's literally her thing. Yeah.
And
it's pretty messed up. It's actually great, I think.
It's a very delicate balance, right? Of like, she somehow she being the author, not Ava Braun, she somehow manages to like not ignore how horrifying and terrible the Holocaust was, but also like have that as the background of the more character grounded, like mystical, dark in a different kind of way story. Like, it definitely doesn't erase or minimize the horror of like what it is to fucking genocide a people.
Yeah, because they're like people who did this, right? It's not like monsters who did it. And I think it's so easy to fall into that. And so often, you know, like, especially when Americans make supernatural stories that involve Nazis, we make Nazis into literal monsters. And I think that it kind of excuses things in a way to be like, well, this is their nature. You know, the author is like exploring something about human nature, which is monstrous and alarming and is an important. I'm always interested in this when Japanese artists investigate World War II, because Japan was allied with Germany and was up to very terrible shit in China and Korea that is like exactly parallel to the Holocaust, which I don't think that a lot of Americans are very well educated on.
Really,
we tend to like see Japan as like victims.
The Pacific Theater in World War II is basically compressed down into like, was it right to drop the bomb or not? Like, we're still stuck on, was our attempt at like basically genocide acceptable or not?
Right. This is actually really kind of fitting that we're talking about this right now, because like the the anniversary of the bomb drop was like a day or two ago from when we're recording, and it's still a non-response. Like, apparently the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been constantly asking for acknowledgement of how awful the nuclear bomb drop was to the countries that have nuclear weapons still, and like there's like no response, and we're still stuck on this very, very binary approach to World War II, and it's hard for people to understand that two things can be true at once. The bomb drop was
what?
I know, right? It's like the bomb drop is absolutely horrifying and an act of attempted genocide, and then also Japan was complicit in multiple massive war crimes, not just against people outside of Japan as we know it, like Korea and China, but also in Okinawa. Like, this, it's
and their own soldiers too.
And then one of the things that's really interesting with Pet Shop of Horrors is that how this shows growth for D, because D's family was largely killed off, that there's only the D lineage of these beings because of genocide. So at this point, like if this had shown up in the previous volume, in the previous series, it would have been in line with D realizing that his path, like the unexplored, like he never, until like maybe the midway point of the first series, he didn't really think about why he was doing what he was doing. It was plainly like, I'm going to punish humans because of what humans did to us. And so this the side story shows that before all of this, in the late 1930s, 1940s, that D's grandfather was so adamant on punishing humans that he kind of helped,
or he let it happen.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. It's kind of terrible. I keep forgetting that. Not forgetting, but like, God. Like, in terms of terrible characters.
That, like, speaks to the Japanese complicity of it all, right? Like, they aided and abetted Germany, and I don't think that a serious artist can, like, look at that period and not contemplate what that means. And then, like, you get somebody like the creator of Attack on Titan on the one hand who will, like, defend that with a kind of pride and be like, no, we were a great empire and we were held back. Or, like, this kind of introspection of, like, there's something monstrous about enabling abusers. Like, your need for love, which is a human need, which is a normal healthy human need, can go so far as to, like, ruin an entire nation, and, like, turn the world inside out because you indulge in that need so deeply that you become monstrous. That's really interesting.
It is absolutely a sign that Akino Matsuri sat with what, because there are things that you can't flesh out in a manga. It's not enough pages, the audience might not pick up on it, or they'll pick up on the wrong things, but the overarching themes across the generations of Ds is that they are always growing. Like, so they're actually supposed to be the same person. Not like in literally, but like, it's, I had this son, he will follow my mission, he will do exactly as I did. But then they're all, personality-wise, very different, and they're all growing. So the little D that's in California now is more progressive than Count D, who's more progressive than his father, who's way more progressive than his grandfather. And it's just like a lineage that is growing. It's really interesting. Like, I have to see, like, the other series that are in this are prequels. So it's like France in the 1900s, like, or the 19th century, so the 1800s. So I'm like really interested to see how those match up with what we know of D in the present. Seeing these characters pre modernity, I guess, like how they interacted with the world, because like humans, I would say humans several centuries ago were different. Not better, but just so vastly different that your response to them as an immortal would have to be different.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think the world building there on how D works is also in line with like Chinese sensibilities about rebirth and like recurrence of yourself. And this is not like a, you say Chinese is like problematic, racializing type of a thing. And then also, like China is largely an atheist state now, so it's not like people exactly believe in these kind of things, but Count D is like kind of a throwback anyway in the sensibilities of like, mysterious Japan. Anyway, the point being like that as you are born again and again in kind of like the Washa idea of how the existence of the soul works, it's not just a carbon copy recapitulation of the same thing. There's an evolution, a growth, like you're saying, over time. And hopefully you're coming to like a deeper enlightenment, more compassion. The world building of D in particular, like you said, across all these different series illustrates that kind of idea or explores that kind of idea. Even if it's just using it as a story device.
It's really interesting. And I kind of hope that like other people get into it over the years so we can maybe get the other stuff translated officially so we can see how we can put the different Ds into conversation and see that trajectory better. I think the grandfather mellows in a way that the father never does, but the grandfather starts out like really bad. And is then like by the time D's are on, he's like, oh, I guess my grandchild, I guess I have to be better. But the father's like, no, this thing that I brought into this world isn't behaving great, I'll take him out. Like,
right.
Genuinely terrible.
It's so interesting hearing you guys talk about this because I only read 3 volumes, and I feel like with that little chunk, I didn't quite get as much of like Count D's story. I mean, there were a couple chapters that dealt with his grandfather. I was much more focused on like the episodic stories and what they were saying rather than like the overall arc. So it's cool to hear that there's like a lot more there that I just like didn't quite get to yet.
But you will eventually.
Yes. I mean, one of the themes that I think jumped out the most just from the 3 volumes that I read was the idea of sacrifice. I actually almost bounced really hard off of the first chapter of the first volume because it involves the pet helping a mother sacrifice her life to save her child, which is a really like it can be a really meaningful thing, but I think it also is something that is expected of women and of mothers in a way that it's not expected of other type of people. And I was just kind of like, like, is this whole thing gonna be just kind of like regressive, playing into ideas of gender? And I could not have been more wrong.
That first story. Yeah.
I feel like there is just kind of like a gross way of like suggesting that people should always sacrifice themselves or like lose themselves and have nothing, no like sense of individuality or like, sense of self-preservation. But like a lot of the other chapters, I think, really play off of that differently. Like there's one where the purpose of the pet isn't to help someone be ready to sacrifice themselves, but it's about helping people let go of other people, be accepting of other people sacrificing themselves, or the one where the pet is essentially like helping an older couple deal with the fact that their child died.
Yeah.
But in like a really bittersweet way, because like the pet is helping them cope, but also kind of like preventing them from really moving on. And like ultimately she just decides to stay with them until they die. So it's like, are they ever really going to move on? I don't know. It's like there's lots of really interesting questions about like, what is the catharsis that we need and how do we go about getting that? Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot. Like, the majority of the stories deal with some form of sacrifice, whether it is the human sacrificing something or the pet sacrificing something, because the pet sacrifices for the old couple. That's a sacrifice to not go back to the pet shop, because the pet shop is essentially like a sanctuary.
Yeah.
The ones that focus specifically like on love, like the deepness of the love that develops or exists between the customer and the pet they get from Count D, it's marked by this like profound sacrifice or like this deep suffering. The chapter, I think it's in the first volume, with the Yakuza dude. He's in love with his boss, and he has her dog bite him at the end to make her let go of him. So they fall, and then like every time I read it I cry, because
that was the one that I was thinking of that I think provides such a strong kind of like counterpoint to that first chapter where the mom sacrifices herself.
They live together in the pet shop forever. Like, who's this terrible looking dog? He's just a stray.
I think you can read that first story differently too, like after you understand how kind of complicated it is, because it was her desire to fulfill her patriarchal role as a mother that destroyed her. And that's not really an endorsement of doing that. You know what I mean? Like, and it was her toxic boyfriend coming back. Like, she, on the one hand, she knew that he was going to come back because she could feel it deep inside of her, that the anxiety of it was giving her nightmares. She felt very much like it was going to happen. And yet when she had opportunities to change her life and move away, even though those opportunities are not great, she doesn't take them. And instead, she like, it's almost like an easy way out for her, morally speaking.
I see.
Where you can't like, you can't like say, oh, she was a bad mom, because she was like, even the news like kind of underlines, wow, what a great mom she was. But now she's not in this kid's life anymore.
One of the things it made me think of, the first time I read it, I was in my Toni Morrison phase, which is a weird phase to have, but it is a phase I did have. Toni Morrison did Beloved, which revolves around a formerly enslaved woman who killed her daughter. Like, she was going to kill all of her children, but killed her daughter to basically save her from being taken back into slavery. It's based off of something that happened. Like, there was a case, it was documented. And for the rest of the book, she is haunted by Beloved, by the ghost of her daughter, in very, very visceral ways. When I was reading it, I was thinking how in grad school I did a class and we covered Beloved, and one of my classmates was like, well, she made a bad choice to kill her daughter. And I was like, what choice would you make? Like the future you could see for your child was horrific. And like the sacrifice and stuff is like really complicated. The scene in the chapter where she swings the child in front of her and he gets hurt was like, absolutely, you shouldn't do that. But ultimately these choices happen because they're not good choices. If you don't see that there is an alternative, you're gonna make the bad choice. And she didn't really have an alternative because she died. That's like, the choice was my life or my kid's life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very depressing.
Well, it's
Yeah.
horror, right? It's exploring that space, and it's confronting us. So often, stories begin and end in the middle of things, right? That's the famous thing about stories, and they don't go all the way until people die. They just end on some note that is supposed to give us some kind of idea about life. But like, to go to the end of this woman's life where she is murdered by her ex-boyfriend, the entire context of it changes to be like, well, what does that event mean for her? And for her, it was about like fulfilling her role as a mother as she saw it. And then we, the audience, are left in the space of like contemplating the meaning of that and the worth of it. And I don't think the story necessarily is pushing us in any direction. It's just exploring the space, because it's, like, if it was marketed towards kids, I would expect a little bit more input from the story to say like, and that was good, or and that was bad. But adult fiction tends not to do that. It just tends to throw something at us to chew on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I also found the pandemic episode really interesting, obviously, like, given that it was written, so long ago. I guess post-SARS, or maybe during SARS, the original. I found it interesting because in the story, it kind of like plays into a lot of the pandemic conspiracy theories that are running wild right now. Like the vaccine in the comic, it literally is a plot by the government to get rid of all the undesirables and like kill people, which was so weird to read about that. It asks a lot of really interesting questions about quarantine and sacrifice. Again, what we were saying, that I think is the episode where Count D talks the most explicitly about what is the value of a life. Or I think the word he uses is the weight of a life. It's really hard to make those kind of trolley problem calculations that life doesn't work that way.
Yeah. It's probably one of the best stories in the run because of how it applies still. Like, so some of the stories are not always timely, especially any of the ones that involve tech, because those are always really, like, wild to realize how much we've done, even in just looking at, like, the tech on display. But with like, the pandemic stuff, this is, like, what we are dealing with now, but it's also what people dealt with then, and what people dealt with, like, with the Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of just reinforces that we're just really not good at getting out of ruts, actually.
It's even what happened, with like the Black Plague and stuff in Europe. It's always the underclass who pays for things, like any way you want to slice it. It's always the lower class people who die.
Yeah.
And if enough of us die, then the rich people get destabilized.
I never realized that.
Which is like, again, sacrifice and sucks.
Yeah. And I think the fact that the pets are also in like a very liminal in-between space between animals and humans, I think it does a good job of highlighting how hypocritical a lot of the stuff we do with respect to animals is. Like, I'm not a vegetarian. I can't really like speak to that without being a bit of a hypocrite. But, when there is, like an outbreak of avian flu or something, and we're trying to keep it from spreading, and or like, like foot and mouth disease, and it's like, okay, we'll just like slaughter all of the pigs or all of the cows or all of the birds or whatever in this region. Like, we think about it from a very practical, utilitarian, like economic perspective, and not even from the perspective of like, we are killing all of these creatures that are, maybe not sentient in the human way, but have some level of cognition and emotion that is probably closer to us than we would like to acknowledge.
Yeah. I experience a lot of, not necessarily guilt, but like I'm hyper aware of like eating. Like, so one of my episodes, I did an episode with the rapper that I love. She is a vegan and she's in Korea, and she's like, it's very difficult. Korea is very much not a place that makes being vegan super easy. And so we were talking about that. We were also talking about like just how we don't think about animals. It's like, oh yeah, I had barbecue. I ate this. Or like, even one of the things I think about is how we talk about roadkill. First of all, roadkill. That's the word we use. But also there's never really a sense of like, aw, this hurts. It's just, oh, that's gross, and we move on. But we wouldn't do that for a person. And it's just very complicated, and like whenever I think too hard about this, I'm like, I'm gonna just be sad somewhere because it's tough.
It creates a discontinuity in like our experience of the world, which I think is what is really good about this story, as like a set of stories, but is also the thing that horror is really good at. And I guess what I mean is that as humans, we believe that first, we understand and correctly perceive the universe around us. And then second, we have a lot of control over it because of that perception. And, like as our technology has gotten better and we have more influence over the world, we just tend to think that like our interior moral sensibilities should be like inflicted on the world. So, you talk about like vegetarianism. Like, I understand when people talk about like the suffering of animals, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. But there's the other side of that coin is that it ignores that we are also animals who live on death, like everything else in this world does that is alive. Like everything that needs energy gets it from something else
except
dying.
for plants.
Even like, well, I was going to say even plants, because there's biological material in the soil that they need
and pitcher
in
plants.
order to exist.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some plants, and some plants are parasites, like feeding off of other plants, like mistletoe and stuff.
Other plants, yeah. And so there's like, and I don't say that as like, and therefore the world is an immoral place where we can do whatever we want. Like, that's not what I'm saying. Our human culture will tend to try to insulate us from the actual world. Like, this is like the long-term project, I think, of like human culture at large, is to try and put ourselves into a bubble where the world makes sense to us. And the world is not interested in our perspective on this, I think. Like, it does what it does, and that invades our sensibilities sometimes, like in the form of a pandemic, for example, and underlines for us every once in a while how we are in control of absolutely fucking nothing. And we don't understand the world, actually. We just understand a tiny slice of it, maybe. And that is like very colored by our cultural history and a lot of other assumptions that have been baked into the way that we've been taught to see the world. And I think horror is really good at uncovering things that we are used to in a different light.
Yeah.
And so that's what this series does really well, is like, oh, you want a cute pet that is going to like help you emotionally and give you companionship? Well, here is a whole nother light on sacrifice, love, companionship, lifelong relationships, romance, and, every other human experience. The dark side of that, so to speak. The side that's uncontrollable, the side of the universe that we don't understand and probably never will be able to totally comprehend.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. I always recommend, even though I hate Eli Roth, History of Horror says similar things to what you just said about like the nature of horror, the role of fear in fiction. And so while Eli Roth is terrible and whatever, it's still a good series to kind of like branch off of and explore what we're into. I don't think, like, a lot of people who are into horror kind of think of it in terms of like, oh, well, how many dead bodies will we see? And horror is really far beyond that. Like, there's not actually that much gore in Pet Shop of Horrors. It's more like psychological, situational. You're like, oh, that doesn't feel good, but it's not because you're seeing something gross. It's because you're being faced with your humanity or the absence of humanity as you understand it. It's really good. I really love this.
Yeah, I was afraid of that, to be honest. Anya sent the books to me, and she was like, this 90s horror manga that I've never heard of from kind of like a beloved but obscure place. And I was like, oh no, like I've read horror manga. Is this, are people's faces going to be split in half and as like grotesque corpses? But this is like really psychologically situated and is really, really well written, I think, and nuanced and balanced and thoughtful.
It's so good. And it compares to because like the other book that I was like, oh, we could possibly do this was Count Kane. But Count Kane not only is incredibly gory at points, because that's what Kaori Yuki does, but it's also, I think, full of violence against women that is not actually ever addressed. Like, people don't get punished well enough for that. They're just like, yeah, this happens. It's Victorian era England. And it's like, okay, but that didn't actually happen in Victorian era England. Like,
you're just using that as an excuse.
I mean, it's old, so like all of my favorite manga series are like from 2008 or earlier. Pretty much exclusively josei manga for that older generation. And then it was usually like some kind of thriller or horror series because of what it showed you about the author and the audience. Because we're talking about like Japanese women in their 20s and 30s creating and consuming this. And at the time when I was reading them, it wasn't really easy to find like blogs or YouTube videos, right? Like you didn't actually have this access to find out like what horror these people were experiencing, what they thought of. And manga created by and for them was a really good gateway into like me being super nosy and looking into fandoms later. I was like, oh, this had a fandom, these people were influenced to create. Like there are books that I can probably, like if I sat with them, I could probably point at the references to Pet Shop of Horrors because it wasn't just formative for me, it was formative for a lot of people in and out of Japan. And that's some things like we've talked about the differences between Japanese media and like what's marketed here in the US. And it's relatively recently that we're seeing this kind of introspective horror show up more in young-ish adult fiction to adult fiction. And it's because a lot of people who grew up like us, like me and Alan, who read manga and who internalized really interesting plots and ideas, are now getting to write and publish here in the US. So it's like, they can go, oh yes, I read this really great book, I had questions, and then they put those questions into what they do. I'm sure someone out there is like, yeah, I've totally been inspired by Pet Shop of Horrors. Yeah. And that's so cool.
Yep. It's like the whole phenomenon of like, now there's I think there's 100% black anime studio, from like the line artists to like animators to voice people, which is so funny because like when I was growing up, it was considered like a black subculture thing, which I wasn't aware of at the time. But that was because it was like some of the only content that you could get that wasn't made by white people in America, right? And that was like speaking to something different, and you were allowed to watch it because it was animated and you were a kid. It's so weird, the intersection of all that.
There's a whole thing where like a lot of the rappers, like so like 20 rappers, like Asian culture, it's featured very heavily. Yeah. Different Asian cultures feature very heavily in, like, hip-hop, right? Like, you have Wu-Tang Clan, you have Megan Thee Stallion with her obsession with My Hero Academia. Lil Uzi Vert has talked about his interests in anime, in K-pop. He stands G-Friend, though, so we don't trust his opinions, just letting you know. Just saying. But it's like a really interesting relationship, because then at the same time in these countries, right, you have the My Hero Academia person, his one of his designers who does like the fashion loves Megan Thee Stallion. That influence is in the art from one of the characters. You have Korean idols who are like, yeah, I love blah 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 blah. Like one, even though it's a really terrible movie, one Korean idol was like, I love The Help. Unfortunate, but he loves The Help. And then you have like the cultures are in conversation, and I think that's really interesting to see, because like, I don't know, it's really, really positive to think about how many people have been really well impacted by this media, and how much of modern storytelling worldwide has been influenced by really interesting series like Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors, like Sailor Moon, like Parasite, which is terrifying, but it did influence a lot of people.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Yep. Eva, stuff like that, you know, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and all that
Also
stuff,
a thing I shouldn't have watched as a child.
I'm way more influenced by the manga and anime that I read than even like the Marvel comics, which I absolutely loved in the 80s and 90s, just because they were more complicated and they were like more artistically honest and more sophisticated. You know, like I love the old Stan Lee comics and, you know, like Ultimate Spider-Man and things like that. But at the end of the day, like, give me Berserk or give me, you know what I mean? Like
complex, something that might be upsetting, but is ultimately well thought out and interesting. And
yeah,
because I did a lot of work when I was in like undergrad on like comic books, and there is absolutely a point where you're just like, well, why can't you return to what comics were before the Comics Code? Why can't you make interesting comics for everyone? Because I guess like at the same time that English language, like superhero comics, are seen as for children, right? Like, so you can't have like sex on the page, like not even really the implication of it, unless it's in certain adult brands, right? At the same time, you have that, where it's like, this isn't for children, but then the plots feel incredibly immature. It's very rare that you get a fleshed out, like, super full arc that impacts the future of a universe. Like, so volume 1 of Tokyo Pet Shop of Horrors matters. You know, the last volume is going to reference stuff. You know, like, they're still pulling from the first volume. With DC and Marvel, something that comes out today isn't going to matter 5 years from now. It may not even matter 5 months from now.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point that I'm making, that we like systemically made that choice to be irrelevant by like infantilizing an entire genre of art. Of like, well, graphic art and animated art is for children, therefore it's irrelevant. And so what became really influential in North America was graphic art and animated art that came out of other places that didn't make that choice. So it's just funny to me because like that's a conservative impulse to be like, oh no, Batman will make you gay.
No, Poison Ivy makes you gay, Alan.
Right, yeah, Poison Ivy does make you gay though, that's true. But you know, but at the same time, they're the kind of people who are like, China is scary, and we're better than Japan because they're Asian. They're more influential on my generation, on millennial generation, than America is, because their art was not stifled. If you see what I'm saying, it's like Gollum biting the ring off and falling in the volcano. Like they undid themselves by fucking up the art of North America.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Well, I feel like we kind of got at what our outro usually is, but without having to explicitly ask the questions. So we could just join us next time for an episode on the first 3 books of the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. And we're going to be discussing that with a special guest, Kate, or Caitlin, who you might know from his Dark Materials podcast, Measures of Truth. And I am really looking forward to that conversation. It's a super interesting series. Each book kind of has a different little catch that has to do with an unreliable narrator or perspective. But the books really work even once you already know kind of like what the catch is and go back and reread it. And I think they're just, the characters are great. And it's a really interesting story.
We're doing like the woman author hat trick at this point.
Oh yeah, because we did like Animorphs and then this one and now that. I mean, we have a lot of women authors on the show.
Oh no, it's great. It's just I'm just trying to think if that wasn't on purpose or anything. It just happened to play out that way.
And if you like what we do, don't forget to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stitch. We had a great time talking with you. Why don't you tell people where they can find you and your work online?
Sure. So you can go on my website, which is Stitch's Media Mix, or you can find me on Teen Vogue. I have a column where I talk about fandom, all of the fandom, called Fan Service, and that updates twice a month. No idea when during the month, but 2 times. And that's everything else is on my website. So if there's anything you're interested in, that's where you'll find it.
Awesome. I'm Anya, and you can follow me on Twitter at StrangelyLiteral. That's strangely, then LITERL.
I'm Alan, and you can follow the show on Twitter at HGStorycast. Visit our website at hgstorycast.com.
And if you'd like to leave us feedback, you can visit hgstorycast.com/contact or send an email to contact@hallowedgrownmedia.com. Hallowed Ground Storycast is a Hallowed Ground Media production and is produced under a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike license.